Thought Power, Chapter 4, Thought Contagion. One of the most striking instances of the power of the radioactivity of thought and of the inductive action of thought is found in that class of phenomena which has been called thought contagion or mental epidemics. As these terms indicate, in this class of phenomena, there's a spreading of thought influence and a liability to catch the spirit of the general thought wave, which is spreading itself over a group of people, a community, a nation, or even over the civilized world as a whole. In its simplest form, a thought contagion is found in cases in which groups or congregations of individuals are moved by a common impulse, the latter being originally imparted by some individuals of strong emotional tendencies in the crowd and then rapidly spreading from one to another of the crowd until nearly everyone in the group or crowd has caught the feeling and its accompanying impulse. This class of phenomena, in its simplest phases, is illustrated by the rapid spread of emotional excitement among an audience or congregation under the influence of a magnetic orator, preacher, actor, or other spellbinder, as the colloquial term will express it. You have seen large audiences swayed by a common emotion under such circumstances, and perhaps have yourself come under the influence of the epidemic thought currents. One is often roused to the stage of intense emotion and experiences the impulse to act thereupon by words which, when seen in cold print, seem devoid of any exciting power. In such cases, the orator, actor, or preacher possesses sufficient magnetic force to set things going, and after that, the contagion spreads rapidly until finally nearly everyone in the audience is more or less affected. In cases of revival meetings, the influence of thought contagion is quite strongly manifested. The same principle governs what are known as mobs, creating what is known as the mob spirit. The mob at the beginning may be made up of the average persons of the community, brought together by curiosity or general interest, and free from vicious intention. Before long, some turbulent spirits in the crowd begin to manifest emotional excitement and start to arouse a similar feeling in their neighbors. If the conditions are favorable, before long the contagion has spread and the epidemic has assumed alarming proportions. If the impulse and influence be sufficiently strong, the crowd veritably becomes a mob, and in some cases proceeds to commit acts of violence and destruction of which the majority had no thought in the beginning, and of which but few of its members would have been capable under ordinary circumstances. When the influence is past, most of the individuals are aghast at the acts which they have helped to perpetrate. The following newspaper report of the mental epidemic manifested at one of Paderewski's recitals several years ago will illustrate the thought contagion frequently in evidence in audiences and congregations. There is a chatter, a rustling of programs, a waving of fans, a nodding of feathers, a general air of expectancy, and the lights are lowered. A hush. All eyes are turned to a small door leading onto the stage. It is opened. Paderewski enters. A storm of applause greets him, but after it comes a tremulous hush and a prolonged sigh created by the long, deep inhalation of upward of 3,000 women. Paderewski is at the piano. Thousands of eyes watch his every movement through opera glasses and with an intensity painful to observe. He the idol, they the idolaters. Toward the end of the performance, the most decorous women seem to abandon themselves to the influence. There are sighs, sobs, the tight clenching of the palms, the bowing of the head, fervid explanations. He is my master are heard in the feminine mob. Other equally striking examples are reported by the thought contagion and the mental epidemics manifested at the meetings of the successful evangelist or revivalist. You will at once recall instances within your own experience. Immense crowds are aroused to the highest pitch of excitement. Individuals throw aside their customary reserve and dignity and indulge in emotional extravagances of speech, demeanor, and action. Shouts, moans, and groans are heard. Some persons fall into spasms brought on by overexcitement. Others faint or fall into trances. The crowd rushes to the altar to confess its sins and to seek salvation. The pockets of the crowd are emptied into the collection receptacles. Often jewelry is torn off and tossed into the plate. Even the scientific observer, though holding himself well in hand, often feels the surges of emotional contagion and may even be surprised to feel the tears coursing down his cheek. Though his head remains cool, his heart has been aroused by the heart of the emotional contagion. In the case of the mob, a similar physiological background exists. Cedes describes as follows a crowd being infected by the mob contagion. When the preacher, the politician, the stump orator, the ringleader, the hero gains the ear of the crowd, an ominous silence sets in, a silence frequently characterized as awful. The crowd is in a state of overstrained expectation, with suspended breath that watches the hero or the interesting, all-absorbing object. Disturbing impressions are excluded, put down, driven away by main force. So great is the silence induced in the fascinated crowd that very frequently the buzzing of a fly or even the drop of a pen can be distinctly heard. All interfering impressions and ideas are inhibited. The crowd is entranced and rapidly merges into the mob state. Tolstoy, in his War and Peace, pictures the mental condition of a crowd which was rapidly being transformed into an entranced mob. The crowd remained silent and pressed on one another closer and closer, to bear the pressure of one another, to breathe in this stifling, contagious atmosphere, not to have the power to stir, and to expect something unknown, incomprehensible, and terrible became intolerable. Those who were in the front, who saw and heard everything that took place, all those stood with eyes full of fright, widely dilated, with open mouths, and straining their whole strength, they kept on their backs the pressure of those behind them. Cedes, in the following striking passages, cleverly pictures the effect of mental suggestion upon an entranced crowd, rapidly sinking to the mob state. The suggestion given to the entranced crowd by the master spreads like wildfire. The given suggestion reverberates from individual to individual, gathers strength, and becomes so overwhelming as to drive the crowd into a fury of activity, into a frenzy of excitement. As the suggestions are taken by the mob and executed, the wave of excitement rises higher and higher. Each fulfilled suggestion increases the emotion of the mob in volume and intensity. Each new attack is followed by a more violent paroxysm, a furious, demoniac frenzy. The mob is like an avalanche. The more it rolls, the more menacing and dangerous it grows. The suggestion is given by the hero, by the ringleader, by the master of the moment, is taken up by the crowd, and is reflected and reverberated from man to man until every soul is dizzied and every person is stunned. In the entranced crowd, in the mob, everyone influences and is influenced in his turn. Everyone suggests and is suggested to, and the surging billow of suggestion swells and rises until it reaches a formidable height. The mob energy grows faster than the increase in numbers. The mob spirit grows and expands with each human increment. Like a cannibal, it feeds on human beings. The mob has a self of its own. The personal self is suppressed, swallowed up by it. So much so that when the latter comes once more to the light of day, it is frequently horrified at the work, the crime that the mob self had committed. Once the mob self is generated, or truer to say, brought to the surface, it possesses a strong attractive power and a great capacity for assimilation. It attracts fresh individuals, breaks down their personal life, and quickly assimilates them. The assimilated individual expresses nothing but the energy suggestion, the will of the entranced crowd. He enters fully into the spirit of the mob. The extreme impulsiveness of the mob self is notorious. No sooner is a suggestion accepted, no matter how criminal, how inhumane it might be, then it is immediately realized unless another suggestion more in accord with the general nature of suggestions in which the mob itself was trained interferes and deflects the energy of the mob in another direction. Cases are a record in which individuals who plunged into the midst of an excited mob with the full purpose of counteracting its purposes were themselves overcome by the contagion and fell in with the actions of the mob, although the latter were directly opposed to their normal feelings, convictions, and interests. A Russian writer cites an instance in which a soldier bitterly denounced the mob, which was beating to death his old commander, who, he said, had been like a father to him. Being urged to help the man who had befriended him, he rushed into the crowd with that avowed purpose. A few minutes later, he was discovered beating the old commander with a club, like the rest of the crowd. Being reproached, he said, "He was indeed like a father to me, but in such a time when all the rest strike him, why should I keep quiet?" Jews have been caught in anti-Jewish crowds, and vice versa, the individual being carried away by the thought epidemic. Almost incredible instances are recorded concerning the influence of thought contagion, leading to the participation of persons in mob movements directed against their own kindred class, sect, or faith. Another form of thought contagion, or of mental epidemics, is the condition of panic or stampede manifested by crowds, communities, and even entire countries at many times in history. There have been many instances of the rapid and widespread of popular fear of the coming of the end of the world. It would seem that at least once in every generation, a panic or craze of this kind breaks out. Someone starts the rumor that the world is coming to an end on such and such a day. The conditions of the popular mindset become propitious. The rumor is taken up and accepted by many, and before long reaches the degree of thought contagion or mental epidemic. Before the inevitable subsidence, thousands are affected, and in many cases, deplorable results arise. Insanity, suicides, through fear, neglect of financial interests, breaking up of families, destruction or disposal of goods and property, all these are incidents of this form of thought contagion. Similar mental epidemics arise from the appearance of comets, accompanied by dire prophecies, the appearances of plagues of various kinds, the rumors of financial calamities about to overtake the country, and similar prophecies or promises of evil. In short, it seems that under certain general psychological conditions arising from a number of favoring causes, it is possible that a panicky condition or a general stampede may be started from the simplest beginnings and by reason of the most irrational ideas. Like a herd of frightened cattle or horses, like a crowd of sheep, like a flock of chickens, the great masses of people catch the contagion, take fright, work themselves into a state of panic, and away they go in a wild stampede, all without valid reasons or sufficient motives. In the same way, strong waves of speculative excitement, gambling crazes, get-rich-quick epidemics have affected large masses of people. Apparently, all at once, great numbers of people will rush to invest their hard-earned money in some wild, fantastic, unbusinesslike scheme, which has been widely heralded. Then scores of similar schemes are evolved. Like mushrooms, they grow overnight. Persons heretofore careful and prudent throw aside all caution and forethought and actually beg the promoters of the wild enterprises to accept their money to let them in on the scheme. Then sooner or later, the bubble bursts and the excitement dies out at once. After it's all over, the public wonders how it could have ever happened. The people keep on wondering until history repeats itself, as it always does when given sufficient time. As illustrations of the financial crazes or epidemics due to thought contagion or mental epidemics, we cite the following three celebrated instances. Number one, the tulip craze of 1634, where the Dutch people experienced an epidemic of belief in the get-rich-quick possibilities of tulip raising. Ordinary industry was suspended and practically everyone took to raising tulips. Fancy tulips rose in value equal to that of diamonds. They were sold by the grain or even by the more minute weights. People sold their houses and lands, their furniture and their businesses in order to speculate in tulips. Money poured into Holland from other countries to which the epidemic had spread. In time, a panic succeeded the craze and the bubble burst, causing the ruin of thousands of people. Number two, The Mississippi Company craze of 1717, in which the thought contagion or mental epidemic reached heights which now seem almost incredible. This craze has its seat in France, where John Law, a shrewd Scotchman, obtained from the region of France the exclusive rights for his company to trade on the west bank of the Mississippi River in America. Later, the exclusive privileges were extended to the East Indies and the South Seas. Law announced probable profits of 125%. Thousands of enthusiastic Frenchmen of all ranks and classes fought at Law's door for the privilege of subscribing for shares in his company. The nation indulged in an orgy of gambling. The streets were transformed into trading floors for the sale of stock. The public acted as if it were drunk. The wildest excesses were manifested. Finally, the bubble burst. Thousands of persons had lost their all, and many were reduced to actual poverty. Number 3, the South Sea Bubble of 1720, in which the English public was subjected to a severe attack of thought contagion or mental epidemic. The South Sea Company, by means of false rumors, started the craze. The rumors spread, gaining in size and strength as they traveled. Soon it was believed that the investment of £100 would bring a sure return of many hundreds of pounds per annum. People abandoned their ordinary occupations and became speculators in shares of stock. Imitation schemes were born, and people fought to trade in their shares. The whole country was infected with the get-rich-quick virus. The most absurd schemes were evolved, and nothing seemed too silly to receive popular support. The shares of the South Sea Company finally reached the point of 1,000% increase. Finally, the bubble was pricked. Stocks fell, a panic ensued, thousands were utterly ruined financially. These 3 great cases of thought contagion or mental epidemics serve to illustrate the general principles underlying all similar cases. In this country and in Europe, there have been other cases of financial crazes of a similar character, which have occurred during the past century. Every person of middle age will readily recall instances of this kind of greater or less severity. Seedy says of this class of cases, the course of speculation epidemics is to rise to the highest point of heavenly bliss and then to fall to the lowest depth of misery, to pass from a state of acute maniacal exaltation to a state of still more acute melancholic depression. Great waves of religious revival epidemics have at times rolled over countries, affecting many thousands, and in many cases, causing deplorable results. In America, the early part of the 19th century was remarkable for such cases. Several great revival epidemics flourished in this country in the first half of that century. In 1800, in 1815, and again in 1832, the great American revivals flourished. In many cases, the public, especially in remote districts, literally went mad. Hysteria was deemed the hallmark of salvation, and the saner minds in the ministry were rejected by the masses who preferred to follow the lead of the sensationalists. Ordinarily, sober and sane persons attending the meetings acted like wild dervishes. Convulsions, trances, strange fits, barking like dogs, mewing like cats, neighing like horses. These were the signs of conversion according to the insane standards adopted. In some cases, there began a search for spiritual mates, and soon the sanctified were living with affinities with the full consent of their lawful mates. The craze passed in time, leaving behind it a trail of physical and mental wrecks, and in some instances, moral wrecks as well. In this class of mental epidemics may also be placed the great Millerite craze of 1840, arising from the predictions of one William Miller, that the coming of the Lord was at hand and the end of the world was about to occur. The doctrine was widely spread by Miller and his disciples, and before long, the country went wild with it. Finally, an exact date, year, month, day, and hour was announced, in which the Son of Man will come with power and great glory. Then came the gift of tongues and the gift of prophecy to the faithful. Men and women forsook their work and their homes and indulged in orgies of religious hysteria. In many cases, families were forsaken and abandoned. Nights were passed in exhortations and prayers. It is recorded that night was rendered hideous by their screams. Property was given away freely or else abandoned. White ascension robes were prepared by the faithful for the great day. The day came, the faithful waited, some even ascending trees in order to be the first to ascend to heaven. The day came, the faithful waited, some even ascending trees in order to be the first to ascend to heaven. Nothing happened. Great discouragement was manifested by the many who were ruined. A mistake in dates was announced and a new date fixed. Many accepted this change, and the program was repeated. In 1844, the second prediction failed, and the craze was over, leaving behind the usual trail of wrecked minds and bodies. Students of history are familiar with the celebrated mental epidemics of older time. The Crusades epidemic carried men and women and finally even young children toward the Holy Land in order to rescue the Holy Sepulchre. Thousands upon thousands died on the journey. Others were captured and sold as slaves. The final crusade was composed entirely of young children, boys and girls, many of whom met with terrible fates. Then came the flagellant craze, in which thousands of men and women, often or almost entirely nude, marched the streets, screaming. What the fuck? Wow. Oh my God. Oh my God, that's crazy. Okay. 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 Okay, I'm going to try to get the second. Then came the flagellant craze, in which thousands of men and women, often almost or entirely nude, marched the streets scourging themselves with leather thongs until the blood flowed freely. Then came the dancing mania, in which men and women, boys and girls, danced the streets in an ecstatic mental state. Then came the several Messiah epidemics among the Jews, in which the wildest excitement prevailed and almost insane excesses were manifested. Then came the successive waves of witchcraft crazes, in which many thousands of innocent persons were adjudged to be witches or possessed by the devil, and accordingly hanged or burned at the stake. The story is a pitiful one. When reason forsakes her throne, chaos reigns. With the increase of public knowledge and the spread of popular education, the character of these mental epidemics has changed, but the principle remains the same. One needs but to consider the many crazes and mental epidemics occurring during the period of his own experience in order to appreciate the fact that the principle is still operative. Even within the past 25 years, the world has experienced many cases of religious epidemics, financial crazes, the rise and fall of many strange fads, isms, and ologies, strange crazes for extreme fashions in dress, in amusements, etc., are continually having their rise, their brief period of popularity, and their speedy decline. To read a book written 20 years ago is to realize how many now forgotten crazes were flourishing at that time. Students of those of our own times will have a similar experience of amused wonder 20 years hence. In times of great political excitement, particularly during presidential campaigns in this country, these great waves of thought contagion pass over the land, causing mental epidemics of great power. A few days after election, people are wondering what it was all about. The sinking of the Maine in 1898 produced a mental contagion which extended all over the United States and thus made inevitable the war with Spain, which followed a few months later. In 1915, the sinking of the Lusitania aroused a great wave of thought contagion in America, and war at that time was almost caused. Its effects, temporarily held back, were manifested 2 years later when similar occurrences aroused the popular feeling and caused the entry of the United States into the Great World War. The Great World War itself owed its rapid spread and its wide extension in no small measure to thought contagion. Persons all over the world are now looking back in a dazed condition to the terrible happenings of that recent period of the world's history and are wondering how they possibly could have occurred in this stage of civilization. But all thought contagion is not of such a marked or violent character as indicated by the illustrative cases which we have cited. As we have told you in our consideration of thought atmospheres, the atmospheres of places, of cities, towns, villages, districts, houses, stores, offices, etc., are largely due to thought contagion. The thought keynote sounded by strong, authoritative individuals in a community or in a place of business, a church or an office, communities itself to those dwelling in the place or working there, then begins a process of action and reaction, a mutual contagion, which continues until a mental equilibrium is secured and the thought atmosphere of the places becomes set. The mental keynote of an audience, a congregation, a mass meeting, etc., is reached in the same way. The principle remains the same, though its manifestations have a wide range of different expressions. You must not fall into the error of supposing that all thought contagion is harmful, evil, or detrimental, or that every mental epidemic is a bad one. On the contrary, good thoughts are catching as well as bad ones. The influence of thought environments of the right kind is most powerful and has helped to reform many a person and to set him on the right path. One finds it very much easier to pursue the right path of living when he is surrounded by the proper mental atmosphere, just as the opposite kind of mental atmosphere makes right living much harder for him. This fact is instinctively understood by those working for the human betterment, even though they may not understand the true causes underlying what they call environmental conditions. The right kind of environment is the place in which the proper kinds of thought vibrations are habitually manifested and the appropriate kind of mental atmosphere maintained. An understanding of the true causes of environmental influence will serve to clear up many apparent mysteries which attract the attention of all students of the subject. Neither should you fall into the error of supposing that you are at the mercy of every wave of thought contagion, of every mental epidemic that comes to your direction. The more that you understand the nature of thought contagion and mental epidemics, the less liable will you be to be affected or infected by those of the undesirable nature. Forewarned, forearmed, says the old proverb, and it is true in this case. When you know the symptoms, you may deliberately guard against the infection by determinedly turning your thoughts and attention in the opposite direction and by bringing your reason into action. Finally, you may realize so fully the fact that the I am I is the master that you may erect a defensive barrier against all thought influences of a detrimental or harmful character, while opening yourself to the inflow of helpful, positive, advantageous thought influences. In the later sections of this book, these matters will be gone into in further detail. In conclusion, let us remind you that in knowledge there is power, in this matter of thought contagion and influences. A knowledge of the facts is in itself a strong weapon of defense. Again, let us assure you that there is nothing to fear in the case. That is, there is nothing to fear but fear, for fear is the great negative, depressing, weakening mental state. Fear thought invites undesirable mental currents and contagion. Fearlessness repels them. Fearlessness is positive. Fear thought is negative, and the positive always overcome the negatives. The individual who realizes in consciousness the real nature of his I am I and who recognizes his impregnable position may stand on the solid rock of his own selfhood, which is grounded on the base of all power. And from that point, may defy the winds of negative thought influences and the waves of popular mental epidemics, which sweep away the resting places of those who have built upon the sands of the superficial personality. Your real self is a mighty fortress of the gates of which you alone hold the key. Nothing can enter its walls unless you give it permission.